I can confirm that the humanoids on Mars that resemble us, or that are essentially probably our long-lost relatives that remained up there after the solar system catastrophe of 9500 BC, have already been here. They were there in a very advanced craft, and so we know that underground civilization on Mars that includes the humanoids like us is more advanced than us, just as Courtney Brown's team found at Emory University when they remotely viewed Mars. They found that Martian civilization is 150 years beyond human civilization on Earth.
Mm-hmm.
Then getting to 1971, sorry.
I just one note there. Do you know if these particular Martians who you met with, if they, in some instance, represented their military force or their government, or what was this just to, what we call civilians, or what was the relationship, so to speak, or what were they there for? Do you know that?
I believe they were astronauts of that civilization who, like many of our astronauts, were PhDs in science and engineering who were there on an aerospace liaison project,
mm-hmm.
probably to perform technology transfer from their civilization to ours. And my guess there would be an Earth-Mars collaboration to establish an extraterrestrial defense posture. That would be my guess.
Really?
But they were clearly, well, they were at least astronauts. I mean, they had specialized clothing with an emblem on it.
Yes.
So and also they were talking shop with aerospace engineers working for Curtiss Wright. And most of what my dad did at, for example, the Edison labs from 1956 to 64 was solving high-end math problems in the development of the electronic components that were coming out of those labs in New Jersey during the 50s and 60s that ultimately were purchased by Robert Noyce of Intel Corporation, and that became the personal computer revolution. So my father was a BSEE, having graduated from Lehigh University in 1951. He was admitted to Eta Kappa Nu, the Engineering Honor Society. So these wouldn't be, leading American scientists, but they would be certainly American aerospace engineers who were capable of higher-end math and engineering work.
Right.
And so these would have been literally some of the actual aerospace engineers, for example, developing high-performance aircraft for the U.S. military. Because I mentioned that it was at Curtiss Wright where my father had helped design the metal alloy so that the ramjet wouldn't melt when it was in our atmosphere from friction.
How's their English, by the way? Did they speak with an accent, or was it perfect English, or how did he communicate?
The diction was perfect. It was in fact an American accent. It didn't even have a British accent. He said, just as I'm saying it now, he said, it was a pleasure visiting your beautiful planet. It sounded just like a newscaster would sound in the U.S.
Really?
His voice was very high-pitched. It was coming through a native speaker of American English, standard American English, had just breathed helium. It was a very high-pitched. And that's also one of the things we discussed on the way home. I said, why are their voices so high? And he said, because they've evolved in an atmosphere with less oxygen in it. And the high oxygen content of our atmosphere affects their vocal cords the same way that helium affects ours. So it was unaccented American English, but it was in a very high-pitched tone of voice.
Interesting. So this was your first encounter, pretty much, with the Martian humanoids or the Martians. So what happened consequently after this, and how did you end up? I guess we're coming there, but this is one of the main points I want to talk with you about as well, and that is basically how you ended up on Mars eventually, how you got there, so to speak.
Well, that remains somewhat of a mystery, but there were a couple other important events that occurred still when I was a child, and one was that when I was in Albuquerque as a child attached to Project Pegasus, I mentioned in the previous hour on today's show how there was a lot of downtime spent, particularly in Albuquerque, particularly hanging out with Connie Chavez at the restaurant where she worked. And we know all the people there, Wentworth Brown and so forth, who were regulars there, who were running that restaurant. And there was one incident in the summer of 1971. This would have been where I had teleported to New Mexico and spent the whole summer there, and then at the end of the summer teleported back to New Jersey on the day I left. So when I say summer of 1971, for me it was the first summer of 1971. And then I lived a second summer of 71 in New Jersey. When I was attached to Pegasus, I essentially spent 4 time loops, 4 extra summers during those 3 years in New Mexico. because at the end of that set of experiences, that summer in New Mexico, they were looping back. So I spent parts of the summer of 1970, 71, 72, and 73 in New Mexico, accessing it via the teleport at Curtis Wright in Woodridge, New Jersey. But then when those experiences ended, those blocks of special project activities, training, time travel to the past, time travel to the future to 2045, and all the activities that I'm going to be describing in my book, we were always teleporting back to the day we left. So from my alpha timeline on New Jersey, those were time loops that branched off, but I still continued to have a normal set of experiences in New Jersey.
Right.
And during one of the time loops, the first summer of summer of 1971, my dad, Connie Chavez had been essentially babysitting me at the restaurant. She had been just watching over me while my dad was gone when I had a project meeting, because I wasn't privy to all of the project meetings. I was at the project meeting where they described how the kids would teleport there and then teleport to past and future events and then teleport back to New Mexico and then teleport back to New Jersey on the day we left. But I wasn't privy to all of the technical meetings on the project. In fact, I was present at very few of them. My dad would frequently drop me off, and Connie would just sort of supervise me when she was doing her work at the restaurant. And I would sit there and read a book or play solitaire or whatever. Sometimes just sit at the table and just look out into space. I was basically bored a lot of times when I was on the project, but believe it or not. Anyway, so my father came back to the restaurant, and he was so agitated that his upper eyelid was twitching, that would always happen for my father when he was really agitated about something, really concerned. And he said something to Connie that indicated that at some point I do something very provocative. I think it may be my rollout of information about Pegasus. Maybe it'll be the public appeal for Secretary Rumsfeld and Governor Richardson to step forward and affirm my claims. But there was something that my dad had learned that he had just learned. Maybe he had just been briefed on the fact that I was destined to be one of the principal whistleblowers regarding the U.S. development of a quantum access capability under Project Pegasus, in what we were then involved in. But he was very, very concerned. He was concerned almost as if my life was in danger. And she became concerned because she loved my father, and she evinced a motherly concern for me. She had been babysitting me essentially for years when we were in New Mexico on a special project basis. In fact, when I talk about teleporting there in 1967-68, when I was a 6-year-old, to attend that meeting with Dr. Harold M. Agnew when he was director of the W Division at the Los Alamos Labs, I'm not certain of whether there was one previous trip to New Mexico when I was about 4, because Connie was definitely a figure in my life from a very young age. In fact, I had mentioned her a couple of times to my mother, and she didn't know what I was talking about. I was talking about her as Aunt Connie from a very young age, because that's how she had originally been introduced to me by my dad. So Connie became concerned because my dad was concerned, and she could see he was agitated. And she blurted out in front of me, "Is this around the time that he finds all that stuff up on Mars?" And my dad kind of scowled and sort of scolded her, because every time a future data was shared with the person that was implicated in the data, it was supposed to be vetted with the project. In other words, everything that was shared with somebody was an intelligence community function, right? Mm-hmm. It was fraught with significance. So when he was having apparently heart-to-heart conversations with her, he had asked her not to blurt stuff out in front of me.
Right.
And he was again chastising her for just blabbing about something in front of me. Because the threat of revealing future information to somebody is that the refraction between the ultimate event and their foreknowledge may cause the event to misfire in some way. Mm. In the same way that the butterfly effect occurs, at least on a micro level, when you jump back to your alpha timeline from a beta timeline, you can't get the person exactly at the right second, the right nanosecond in their original timeline, because that requires a degree of subatomic mastery that we didn't possess at that time. We were working these gross translations between timelines where there was a little offset when I would get back to New Jersey. Like, my sister would challenge me, "Well, you never talked about that." In other words, there were always these little offsets, these little empirical distortions. I knew I was back with my loved ones and my school classmates and living in the same town and going to the same school, but there were a couple incidents where when I did teleport back to Curtis Wright, there were slight changes in what had occurred. Somebody had moved out of the community when I don't remember that having happened. Some child had been injured or something. In other words, there were slight offsets that